Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name's Repeateron, and today we're going to be doing another build video. This is going to be on the Lok-1 Smart Rifle, or the Loki, or the Lok-on Smart Rifle, whatever you want to call it, the Smart Rifle. This is Engineer's third primary weapon. It pretty much has aimbot for you, as well as in some cases, at least with overclocks, it kind of has wall hacks too, which is interesting. Let's talk about this. We're going to go over the builds that I use for it. I'm going to be going over two builds that I use without any overclocks, and then I'll be going over all the builds that I do use with the overclocks. So first up will be my general purpose build. The second one will be more of a general crowd build if you have more time to set up. So in tier 1, we have increased caliber rounds. This increases our damage from 21 to 27. I mean, increased damage is always nice, but this feels like a really weird amount, and honestly isn't that great compared to our other option. At least I barely ever take increased caliber rounds most of the time. Usually I'm going with expanded ammo bags. This gives us 72 more bullets, so we go from 180 rounds to 252 rounds. At least for me, I run through ammo pretty quick with a smart rifle, so having extra bullets really helps here, and it's just more useful than the damage a lot of the time I find, so that's usually what I take. In tier 2, we have macro lens. This makes it so our acquisition threshold is much smaller, but our lock-on range is twice as far. So usually we can lock on within 25 meters. This gives us 50 meters. But this gives us only 20% of what the overall size is. So it's very good at picking off single targets or for focusing on a target further away. It's not great at focusing on groups of targets then. That being said, if you pair this with a secondary that is really good with dealing with targets, like a full ammo grenade launcher, maybe you have fire on it, or a full ammo breach cutter, then you shouldn't really have a problem there, and you can use this to pick off things at a long distance. You can also just fire the smart rifle one shot at a time if you need to shoot at things at long range, but the bullets do then have spread and aren't going to be nearly as accurate as when you lock on, because they're guaranteed then. Our second option is the CCD array. This increases the threshold at where we can lock onto stuff. So this is pretty much the exact opposite of our first option. Rather than having a very narrow lens that lets us aim at very long range, this is a very wide lens that's made for short range, so you can lock onto multiple targets. Both are good, it depends on what you want though. And then our last option is zoom lens. This just gives you 10 more meters of reach. So if you can't decide between the two and you're okay with the base gun, this one's a great option to take. And it's usually what I take now, or I take the CCD array. I don't really take the macro lens on the regular Loki rifle. Tier 3, we have the electrochemical rounds. This gives us 20% more damage when an enemy is burning or electrified, and these do stack on top of one another. So if an enemy is both electrocuted and being burned, then you do even more damage. Our second option is the smart targeting system. This prioritizes enemies with low health to lock on, and this will not give you any more locks than is what needed on a target. Now the smart rifle is already kind of set to do this base a little bit. It will apply locks to an enemy, but it will only fire out the amount of bullets needed to kill the enemy. So if there's something like a grunt with extremely low health where it will only take 1 or 2 bullets to kill, but you have like 10 locks on it, then your gun will not consume all like 10 ammo for those 10 locks. But it will consume all those locks and just fire out the 2 bullets that is necessary to kill them. If you had smart targeting, this would just consume the 2 bullets and that would be it, because it would only allow you to have 2 locks on that enemy. So this one can be decent. I like it. But there's a lot of instances where it's not really necessary, and even instances with overclocks where it actually kind of hurts them. So if you want to take this one, there's nothing wrong with it, but it does make 2 of your tier 5 options kind of awkward to use, because you might not have enough enemies to lock on to everything if you take the smart targeting. And then our third option is super blow-through rounds. This works just like all the other blow-through rounds, well, most of them. So we can punch through 3 more targets with it. Pretty good, because there's often hordes and you can lock onto a bunch of them, have your bullets go right on through and keep on going to other enemies. With my base gun, I usually run the blow-through rounds just so that I can hit more enemies. For our tier 4, we have the shutter speed sensor. This makes it so our lock-on time is increased by 15%, so we can lock onto targets even quicker. Great. And we have the aperture extension. Now the aperture extension increases the amount of targets that we can have locked on, so we go from having 12 locks up to 18 locks. This one can be good against crowds, especially if you're running the blow-through rounds with it, but if you are running the aperture extension, you probably want to run the electric generator mod and not either the unstable mechanism or the fear frequency, because it's going to take longer for you to use either of these effects because they're affected by the locks. So I usually go with the shutter speed sensor for the faster lock-ons. In Tier 5, we have the electric generator mod. This makes it so once we have 3 locks onto a single target and we fire, the first bullet will electrocute that enemy, dealing electric damage and damage over time. Our second option is unstable lock mechanism. This makes it so when we have full locks on the gun, then we do 20% more direct damage with all shots fired during the burst. This one's really useful too. I like it quite a bit. And then our last option is fear frequency. This makes it so when we are all locked onto the enemy, our last bullet that hits the enemy will fear all enemies near that one. Usually if I'm just running my regular Loki setup, I'm running the damage. I find this pretty useful, especially with the blow-through rounds, because I can lock onto multiple enemies, lock onto them pretty quick, and then do 20% more damage whenever I fire this, as well as the blow-through rounds will do even more damage, assuming they hit stuff. This is the way that I usually build the Loki. If I wanted to go for more single target damage, then going with the electrochemical round and going with the electricity generator can really help, especially if I have some way of setting enemies on fire, or if the team has some way of setting enemies on fire, because then I could be electrocuting enemies, burning them, and still be using this either in a couple like 3-round burst shots, or I can be using it just to lock onto everything and then sometimes electrocuting stuff. So those are usually the 2 ways that I build the Loki. Let's talk about some of the overclocks. The Loki's got some interesting overclocks. First up, we got the armor breaking module. This makes it so when we are at full lock, then all of our bullets have pretty much the maximum amount of armor breaking. This can be really useful because most enemies have armor in the game. At least common enemies do. Armor is a very strange mechanic in this game, same with the armor breaking. The basic grunts have a 20% damage reduction on their body except for on weak spots. So if you hit them in the body, then they'll take 20% less damage unless you have armor breaking that exceeds that 20%. However, other enemies have armor that has health on them, like Praetorians having health on their front part, and guards have armor on their forearms. These armors have health that can be broken as well. There are also other enemies that have unbreakable armor that no matter even if you shoot them with this, it's not going to hurt them, at least if you shoot them in the armored part. So if they have unbreakable armor like an oppressor and you're trying to shoot it in like the front part of it where it's fully armored, it's not going to suddenly break through that armor there. Anyway, pretty much all you need to know is that if you're at full locks, you're going to be doing full damage to most enemies. So let's just put that in quotations and call it good. Now the way you could build this is any way that you would like. You can build it the same way that I just built my standard build. This works pretty well. You could run it with fear if you want. This can also be pretty good. You can run the electricity build. All of them work pretty well with this particular overclock. Our other clean overclock is a racer. Now, a racer increases the maximum amount of lock-ons that we have from 12 to 16. It also increases our magazine size. Now, this one, again, you can run it however you'd like, just like most of the clean overclocks. It works the same if you want to go with this build, although this is going to be less consistent than not running it, simply because you do have more lock-ons then. Although your magazine size is bigger, so you can potentially get even more damage out of this thanks to like the blow-through rounds. You could also run the electrochemical rounds and run the arc generator here and really have no downside because you could lock on as much as you'd like, or if you don't want to lock on very much, you don't have to worry about it. You could also run this with the aperture sight, which I found is kind of fun because then you have 24 lock-ons, but I feel like the shutter speed is usually better in most cases. You also might want to go with the CCD array for this one. I found that kind of helps. That way you just have a wider field of view so you can lock onto more stuff quickly. Alright, then we move on to the more exciting overclocks where we have our first balanced overclock of Seeker rounds. Now, Seeker rounds makes it so our lock-on threshold is wider, so we can lock onto potentially more targets. Our reload is slightly longer at 3.5 seconds, which is kind of noticeable, but you can reload cancel the Smart Rifle pretty effectively. To reload cancel the rifle, just once you see the ammo change at the bottom, switch to your pickaxe real quick and then put it away, and you'll have a little bit faster reload. That does help quite a bit with this one. This overclock also messes with your rate of fire, so your rate of fire is pretty much cut in half, at least once you have all your lock on. If you're just firing this one shot at a time, it will be the exact same. But your locked on shots will always now hit their target, and they will ignore armor and terrain. So this one kind of has wall hacks, because you can aim at something, lock on to maybe a spitballer, walk behind a wall, be completely safe from the spitballer, and fire through the wall and hit the spitballer. That's pretty nice. This one also just completely ignores unbreakable armor. So you can aim right at the face of a dreadnought, not worry about it, and then just let the gun fire, and it will punch right through it, hitting the dreadnought's weak spot. This one's really useful, especially on elimination missions, and it's really useful if you find yourself struggling with things like oppressors. So the way that I build this is, once again, usually going with extra ammo. In tier 2, really any of these are good. I usually go with the extra zoom lens. You really don't need CCD array. It makes your threshold gigantic. Pretty much the entire screen, whatever you're looking at, you can lock onto it so long as you're within range. In tier 3, I usually go with the super blow-through rounds because we're hitting, we're punching right through something. We might as well keep punching through it and see if we hit anything else beyond that. Rounds that do punch through enemies, though, to activate the super blow-through round so they can punch through potentially more enemies, don't have the same effect as the Seeker rounds, though, so they can't just travel through terrain and keep going. That'd be awesome if they could, but that's not how this works. I usually go with the full shutter speed here, just so we can lock on quicker. We could go with the extra aperture sight. It's your call. I just like the faster speed a bit more. And then usually I go with the extra damage because we already are guaranteed to hit whatever we're aiming at. We might as well do more damage to it, although the fear is pretty good too, and even electric rounds wouldn't be bad here. Then up next we have explosive chemical rounds. This one might be my favorite overclock, at least for the Loki. So what this one does is it reduces our damage by 5, so we go from 21 to 16. Not a huge deal, because we can still one-shot swarmers. Actually more effective with this. We lose out on ammo, so we go from 180 rounds to 144 rounds. The upside is that so long as you have 3 locks on a single target or more, the last round that hits that enemy will then explode, dealing damage to all enemies around it, as well as causing fear to all enemies around it. This makes the gun really ammo efficient and very strong against pretty much all enemies, because the explosion can deal damage to everything around it, can fear everything around it, and can break armor from everything around it. You also only need 3 locks on. So as I was saying earlier in the video with the smart targeting, if you have something like 3 locks on a crawler that will just die with 1 shot from this, that doesn't matter, because that counts as the last shot even if you just fired 1 bullet. And the gun will only fire 1 bullet because that's all it needs. So if you put 3 locks onto a jellyfish, fire at it, it will explode with just that 1 bullet, dealing damage to everything around it. So you can clear an entire swarm of jellyfish or an entire swarm of the swarmers with just 1 bullet, which is kind of crazy that you can do that. It's also really good at killing grunts, and it's insanely good at killing things like tri-jaws. You can actually kill them just with a 3-round burst. The way that I build this is going with expanded ammo bags in tier 1, so we have extra bullets. In tier 2, I go with macro lens. Now, I said macro lens is a bit too much zoom, but in this case, we exactly want that. We want to only be targeting 1 enemy, and we want to lock onto 3 targets as quickly as possible. So we want to lock on those 3 locks onto 1 enemy, and that's it, and then let it go. So fire this weapon more like a burst fire gun than a full auto gun. In tier 3, we go with electrochemical rounds. This stacks damage up pretty fast because we're also going to go with the shutter speed for faster lock-ons, and we're going to go with the electric generator mod. Since we only want to lock 3 bullets onto an enemy, and every 3 bullets triggers the electricity status effect, that means every 3 bullets we're going to both electrocute something and make it explode. Then if it doesn't die, the next 3 bullets are going to get 20% increased damage minimum from the electrochemical rounds. They're going to cause another electricity status effect, and they're going to also explode again. That can be a lot of damage and can kill big things very fast. This is definitely my favorite build to run with the Loki as of right now. So now moving on to our unstable overclocks, our first one is Executioner. And Executioner honestly doesn't really come with that much of a downside. It's kind of surprising that this is considered an unstable. Kind of both the Loki's unstables are weird. This one, its downside is that you lose out on 12 ammo in both the magazine and your total amount of ammo. So you lose out on 24 ammo in total, which is already not that big of a deal. The other downside that it says is that you can only target 8 enemies rather than the initial 12. But with some of your effects only triggering when things are fully locked on, you're actually kind of counting this as a buff, because you might as well run damage with this. You also have 50% faster target acquisition, so you lock onto targets twice as fast as you otherwise would. Major upside that Executioner gives you is that you get 50% more damage when you're attacking a weak spot from an enemy. That's a lot of damage, because weak spot damage already gives you usually double damage, so adding another 50% on top of that. The way that I usually build Executioner is I go with extra ammo in tier 1, because I find it more useful than the damage. I go with zoom lens in tier 2, although the CCD array is good and so is the macro lens. This one's completely your choice. In tier 3, we go with the blow through rounds. This is just so that we can potentially hit more enemies and get even more damage out of this. You could go with the electrochemical rounds too, especially if your team's running anything with fire or electricity, so you have like another engineer with stubby, or you've got IFGs with your scout, or you've got like a flamethrower driller, then you're stacking up even more damage on targets and you can kill things incredibly quick then. In tier 4, I go with the shutter speed. Even though the shutter speed buff is pretty minuscule, this only gives you another 7.5 more speed to lock on. But with our other option being the aperture and going back to the 12 rounds, the 12 rounds is still quite manageable because you're locking onto all enemies within half the time that you normally would. So it's not that big a deal, but I do like going with the shutter speed a little bit more. And then either going with the full damage, where we're getting 20% more damage on all bullets, where we're already getting likely 50% more damage on all bullets, so that's nice. Or the fear. Either of these are fine. And then our last overclock is Neural Lasso. And this one pretty much is just a clean overclock. It's really weird that this one is an unstable one. So what this one does is make it so our lock-on time is 15% slower than it normally would be, and our lock-on duration is not as long, so we can't hold on to a target as long. That being said, I rarely notice that. The lock-on speed is slightly noticeable, but it's still not that bad. And what this does is every lock onto an enemy slows that enemy by 10%. These slows can multiply together on top of one another, but the slow effect doesn't last very long. The way that I usually build it is extra ammo. Again, in tier 2, it's your call. Usually I go with CCD array. But zoom lens is also good. I kind of like locking onto more enemies with this. In tier 3, any of these are fine. It's really your call. I do like the smart targeting software with this one, so I'm not locking onto multiple enemies. If I'm already killing them, it doesn't really help me for the slowdown effect. So I will run this. Going with the faster shutter speed just so that we can get back down to about the normal amount of speed. We're actually still slightly faster, but only by 2.3 seconds or 2.3%, so it's not that noticeable. And then going with the fear. This way we're slowing down everything that's not going to die and probably fearing everything that's also not going to die, so enemies can't really get away from us and we can easily get away from them. You could run damage here, you could run the electric generator mod. Like I said, this one just kind of treat it like a clean overclock. So that is the Lok-1 Smart Rifle, or Loki Smart Rifle, or Lok-on Smart Rifle, whatever you want to call it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so very much for watching it. I really do appreciate it. Next time we're going to be looking at Engineer Secondaries, the Grenade Launcher and the Breach Cutter, both of which are really fun weapons and have really cool overclocks. Special thanks to the supporters of this channel. These are my members over here on YouTube and my patrons over on Patreon. They get early access to videos like this, and if you would like to be a part of that, you can. There are links down in the description. Thanks everybody who does that. I really do appreciate it. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye!